I would like to warmly welcome you to the book launch of Iqbal, The Life of a Poet, Philosopher and Politician. To kick off the book launch, I will now invite Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman, Institute of South Asian Studies, and Ambassador at Large at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Singapore, to deliver his opening remarks.
You have seen me too often here today. We have come to the last item of the two-day conference, and I'm surprised that we have still a quite large number of people attending, and that's because of the subject. I think this is the first time that we are introducing an element of culture into our usual South Asian conference. And we have picked on a subject which is, I think, appealing to many people. The life of Iqbal, poet, philosopher, and politician, written by a resident in Singapore, Zafar, who is a writer, who is a scholar, who's a film producer, if I'm not mistaken. And that is something that we rarely have, that combination. And we are very happy that he brought this book to us to do the presentation. Now, a little knowledge is sometimes an embarrassing thing. So my knowledge on Iqbal is not that great. I didn't even know that Singapore had a road named after Iqbal. Mr. Balaji was telling me that in the teacher's estate, we have a Tagore Lane, we have a Munshi Abdullah Lane, and we have Iqbal. So the planners of Singapore obviously know a little bit more than I do. There are two aspects to today's launch. One is the launch and a little video, and that is followed by a panel discussion chaired by Dr. Chowdhury. I'm involved in the first part, and that is the launch. I like to start with a phrase that Zafar uses in the book, that he has a bond with poetry. And therefore, I like to read just a short verse, an elegy written by Iqbal on the death of his mother, which is a very touching piece. It goes, quote, who would wait for me anxiously in my native place? Who would display restlessness if my letter fails to arrive? I will visit thy grave with this complaint, who will now think of me at midnight prayers. All thy life, thy love served me with devotion. When I became fit to serve thee, thou departed. It's difficult to read those words without feeling choked, without feeling the poignancy of the poet. And this is typical of Iqbal. The various translations that I've read, I've not had the pleasure of reading the original. I don't speak Urdu or Dari. But just the translation itself conveys the sadness, the depth of the poet's feeling. And that's what makes Iqbal strikingly different from many of the other poets of his time. Zafar Anjum has been able to extract from the life and works of this great man, Allama Muhammad Iqbal, the essence that is so relevant to our present times. Iqbal is known and recognized to be the dreamer who first conceived of Pakistan. Indeed, the concept was broached in his address at the annual session of the Muslim League in 1930. But Zafar Anjum also underscores those elements in Iqbal that give him a much wider intellectual matrix, both regional and global. Zafar brings out for us Iqbal's message of Hindu-Muslim unity, his ideas of universal brotherhood of man, his urgings to each one of us to develop the powers of self, or kudi, as he uses it, which is, I'm told, synonymous with the word ruh in Quran. Ruh is the divine spark in every human being. And Iqbal's message was, develop this spark to become a totally wholesome man. The best monument we can build for intellectuals, dreamers, poets like Iqbal is to create a society that does not emphasize on differences and petty quarrels among people, but build a united society that actually fights the various ills of society, whether it is disease, whether it is poverty, it is corruption, but stand against it, rather than spending time on petty things to show our differences. The book itself is something that is highly readable. It's a very well-researched book, and it is written by someone who loves poetry. Iqbal was competent in both Urdu and Parsi, and in Dari, I think that's Persian. But he preferred Dari, Persian, to Urdu. He said something to the effect that Urdu was sweet like sugar, but Dari was sweeter in language. So and I think Zafar has captured the spirit of the man and his writing in the book. There'll be a discussion on this, as I said, after I launch the book. Now, I like to take this occasion to announce a new initiative. Where's Tan Taeyong? He's there. Because the director's cooperation is needed for this initiative that I'm going to announce. ISAS has got several conferences. We have the Conference of South Asian Diaspora, we have this conference, we have a large number of conferences, which we are fairly good at organizing, and we get good crowd. But what I want to do is to suggest that starting from next year, we have a South Asian Writers Conference. We just saw a Writers Conference in Singapore of international. There is a Writers Conference in Jaipur every year. That is a very well attended, a very iconic event in India. We will not try to emulate that. It will take us some time to reach that level. But perhaps we can do something which is worthwhile and bring together the writers of South Asia to Singapore, and then we can have a day's. I think Taeyong has volunteered that the first one will be next year. So we have, I think, plenty of time to organize. Ladies and gentlemen, I will not reveal further my ignorance on the subject, and therefore I will stop here. I'm very happy to announce the launching of the book, Iqbal, The Life of a Poet, Philosopher and Politician, authored by Zafar Anjum, a Singapore resident. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Pillai. I would now like to invite the author of the book, Mr. Zafar Anjum, and Director of the Institute of South Asian Studies, Professor Tan Taeyong, to come on stage to officially launch the book.
फ़लसफ़ा व मज़हब। ये आफ़ताब क्या, ये सिपहरे बरी है क्या, समझा नहीं तसलसुले शामो सहर को मैं। अपने वतन में हूँ कि गरीब तैयार हूँ, डरता हूँ देख देख के इस तश्त तर्क में। खुलता नहीं मेरे सफ़रे ज़िंदगी का राज, लाऊं कहाँ से बंदाए साहिब नज़र को मैं। हैरान है बू अली कि मैं आया कहाँ से हूँ, रूमी ये सोचता कि जाऊँ किधर को मैं। जाता हूँ थोड़ी दूर हर एक राहदाव के साथ, पहचानता नहीं हूँ अभी राहबर को मैं।
This session will be moderated by Dr. Chowdhury, Principal Research Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies and former Foreign Minister of Bangladesh. Mr. Zafar Anjum is the author of the book, and Mr. P N Balji is the editor of The Independent Singapore. I will now hand over the session to Dr. Chowdhury.
Director Tanta Yong, High Commissioner Khashkeli, ladies and gentlemen, could I welcome you all to the final event of our annual conference. It is befitting, as we just heard Ambassador Pillai say, that we ended celebrating the life and works of one of South Asia's great thinkers, whose impact in uniting a disparate region and polity would be both positive and great if he were not allowed to slip from our consciousness. I speak of Allama Muhammad Iqbal, whose prodigious contributions to the shaping of the South Asian ethos are at the risk of actually getting lost. What will keep it alive as efforts like those of Zafar Anjum, on whose book on Iqbal has just been launched by Ambassador Pillai, and to whom we are all deeply beholden. We're naturally delighted to have Zafar Anjum on the panel, and happy to have another distinguished speaker to speak to us on this subject, and he is Mr. P N Balji, editor of The Independent Singapore, one of the finest minds in the journalistic milieu on the island. It's only fair that I should take advantage of my being the moderator to say a few words on myself on this towering South Asian personality, Allama Muhammad Iqbal, who occupies a rightful place in what Carlyle would have called the pantheon of heroes among the nations of South Asia. Born and bred in Punjab, he wrote in Urdu and Persian and was deeply steeped in the culture of the West through his exposure to England and Germany. And he was exposed to mentors from both East and West. Maulana Rumi, Sir Thomas Arnold, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Wolfgang Goethe. Educated in Lahore, Cambridge, and Heidelberg, he wrote for a global audience. His Payam-e-Mashriq, or Message of the East, was a response through poetry on Goethe's West Ostlicher Divan. The German had bemoaned the pitfalls of Western materialism, and Iqbal had answered by underlining the need for fostering feeling, ardor, and dynamism. His philosophical underpinning is indelibly ingrained in his Asrar-e Khudi that Chairman Pillai spoke of, or Secrets of the Self, which is perhaps his finest poetical work. It's written in Persian. And he speaks of the divine spark in humanity that enabled each of us to reach a fruition in self-realization. The ultimate aim of the ego, he argues, is not to say something, but to be something. His verses termed shikwa are a complaint to God against the ills that his own community, the Muslims, suffered. The Jawab-e-Shikwa is meant to be God's response. As one pours through those verses, one feels the same kind of feeling that one would if one were to turn the golden pages of Milton's Areopagitica. Iqbal did not reside in the ivory tower, as some intellectuals are wont to do, but was also a public person. He was elected a member of the Punjab Legislative Assembly in 1926 and advanced the idea of a political formation of a set of Muslim-majority provinces of India as far back, as you have heard, as 1930. And that is why he had said to have been the first to have envisioned Pakistan. The state he dreamt of for the Ummah is, of course, today a far cry from the fundamentalism that is reflected in the actions of the contemporary ISIS, or the so-called Islamist caliphate. His idea, which of course found fruition in these South Asian states, was like that of the other South Asian poet, great poet, the mighty Rabindranath Tagore, who too had rejected, like Iqbal, the extreme and divisive nationalism. Iqbal's this sort of abjuring of nationalism is evidenced in the lyrics. Sara jahan se acha, the best in the world, when he speaks of Hindustan. In this, Iqbal is like Qazi Nazrul Islam, whom Bangladesh accepts as its national poet. Nazrul Islam had called upon all Indians, irrespective of faith and creed, to awaken, stating that the dawn in India will only break out when its sleeping child awakes. Amra jodi na jagima, kemne shakal hobe, tomar chele utle goma, rat pohabe tobe. O mother mine, he refers to India, addresses India, that is, the night will end and sleep will happen, and morning will happen only when your children arise from their sleep. But perhaps the takeaway from Iqbal's life was not what he said to nations, though also that, but more of what he said to each one of us individually. In this, he was also like Tagore, who had said, if one wishes to cross the sea, it would not do to stand at its edge and just watch the waters. Action on one's part was essential. Iqbal too asked of each of us, work to shape our own individual future. Khudi ka kar buland itna कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से खुद पूछे बता तेरी रजा क्या है. Strengthen yourself, your self-will, so that God, before determining your destiny, would himself ask of you, his creature, as to what it should be. There is no greater recording in literature of the power of human self-endeavor. Today, we live in a South Asia that is sadly divided. Our own poets and philosophers in the past, like Iqbal, as also like Tagore and Nazrul, had seen a unity in our diversity. They had discerned commonalities among our differences. So, are elements that unite us actually deeper than those that divide? Can we identify those elements and thereby seek to bridge our differences? To speak to this and other similar issues, and more importantly, to speak on Iqbal, I would first give the floor to Zafar Anjum.
Actually, Professor Pillai said that I'm a scholar. I'm not actually a scholar. I'm a journalist and a very curious kind of a person. So I move from subject to subject. If you have seen my bio, or if you know about a few books that I've written so far, they tackle business, short stories, and that stuff. So this is a very common question that is asked of me, that why I zeroed in on Iqbal. And if you read the book, the first chapter is about that question itself, that why Iqbal. So today I would like to talk about my connection with Iqbal, and I will talk about him and his life a little bit in the context of the book, if I have the permission. So basically, after writing my last book, I was looking for a topic that I would have felt more deeply connected with. And I was looking at what was happening in the world, in India, in the Islamic world, in the Middle East, other places, the war on terror and everything. And I suddenly felt that probably a person called Iqbal would have felt something similar, because at that time, at the turn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was sinking. The Muslims were losing power from most of the places. In India also, the nationalist movement started, and the inter-community love or understanding or whatever was there was being wrecked because of political reasons. And of course, good and bad, both kinds of people were there. There were some people who were sort of, I'm talking about India now, British India, who were talking about Hindu-Muslim unity, who were singing songs. And there were also other people who were trying to drive a wedge between the communities. And the British were playing their own game, as we know. So I figured that probably at this point of time, what would have Iqbal thought, again, 100 years later? How do you feel today as a Muslim? And I placed myself as an Indian Muslim, and I was thinking that looking at the right-wing change in Indian politics, how would Muslims define themselves in that territory? Then you look across the border, you look at Pakistan. Pakistan is also facing a lot of terrorism. A lot of people call it a near-failed state. Some people will agree to it, some people will not agree to it, but these are the conversations that we have. And among the Muslim youth, I was sensing that there's a sense of despair and hopelessness. So who is the person who could give them some hope for the future? Who could talk about action? Who could talk about carving your own place in the world? Who could talk about and inspire to write your own narrative and not let others write your narrative? When looking at all these angles, I thought that probably I should talk about Iqbal. And I had read Iqbal as a child, along with other Urdu poets like Ghalib, Mir. Iqbal was one poet who always stayed with me personally. His poetry, I always drew inspiration from his poetry. Some of the couplets that Dr. Chowdhury just recited. To shahi hai baseda kar pahadon ki chattanon mein. You are an eagle, you should stay at the heights of the mountains. And Iqbal was one poet who always stayed with me personally. His poetry, I always drew inspiration from his poetry. Some of the couplets that Dr. Chowdhury just recited. To shahi hai baseda kar pahadon ki chattanon mein. You are an eagle, you should stay at the heights of the mountains. and a lot of inspiring poetry that had stayed with me right from my childhood days. That sort of inspired me to look at Iqbal. And when I thought about this, I asked myself, how much do I know about Iqbal? And actually, I didn't know much about him, even though I studied history in my BA class. But I was not taught much about his life. I knew he wrote poetry. I knew that he wrote the Naya Shiwala. I knew that he wrote the Hindustani Bachon Ka Geet, Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara, the Tarana, all these things he wrote. But beyond that, maybe a little bit about his 1930 Allahabad address, that was there. But the main villain in Indian history textbooks would be Jinnah. And he was the hero in Pakistani history textbooks. But Iqbal was not much talked about. And I would talk to my friends on the streets. They didn't know much about Iqbal either. So I thought, why not find out about this man? And I remember, as far as I knew, the only book on Iqbal, his life, his politics, was written in 1990 by Fareed Zakaria, Rafiq Zakaria's father. And I tried to look for that book. I could not find it anywhere. Not in the Aligarh Muslim University library, not in the GNU library. Not even Penguin had a copy of that because it was before the electronics era. So they didn't have the records. This is what I was told. So I felt that I must write this book now. I must tell Iqbal's story. And basically I was driven by my own curiosity to find out more about Iqbal. Then I started my research. I began to learn about him. And I found a lot of fascinating aspects of his personality. We know him as a poet. I didn't know much about him as a politician. We knew a little bit about his philosophy, but there is, the aspects of his personality, the kind of writings he has done, is so elaborate that it is very difficult for an individual to actually partake of all of it, or to actually appreciate all of it. The study of Iqbaliyat in departments of Urdu in different countries attest to this fact. And people do PhDs on just one aspect of Iqbal's writings or his thoughts. And here I was trying to tell his story in this book. So these were the origins of this book, basically. This is what I wanted to convey here as an introduction. And now coming to Iqbal, what was in Iqbal that sort of interested me? All these things. The most important thing for me is his poetry of inspiration, his message of humanism. I was also struck by the fact that in his time, only Iqbal and Tagore were two people, as well-known poets, who critiqued the idea of nationalism. And Dr. Chowdhury just now pointed that out. And the criticism was because, the age of empires was giving way to the age of nation-states. So they were at the cusp of that transition. And how the Europeans were fighting for territory, how the Europeans were waging wars, killing people, their own people, for material gains. So these kind of things were very interesting to me. Also, if you look at his personal life, I always tell this joke that if you want somebody in your family not to become a poet, you should give this book to him. You should talk about Iqbal's life to him. What a life of struggle he led. Then, and before I zeroed in on the idea of writing an entire book on Iqbal's life, I wanted to focus on the 3 years that he spent in Europe, but I didn't have enough material on that. And that would have been a very short book. And meanwhile, I thought that, okay, there are other aspects of Iqbal's life after he came back to India. I didn't even want to go into the politics. But then everything came into shape and it became a book like this, which sort of looks at his life from the beginning to the end.
The worst thing to happen to a panel speaker is to be the last speaker. But it can also be the best thing, because I don't have to say much. Most of it has already been covered by Dr. Chowdhury and the author, Zafar. I must say that I knew very little about Iqbal, and I'm so grateful that Zafar had written a book. And because he's a good friend of mine, well, mainly because he's a good friend of mine, and he gave me a copy of the book, so I decided to read it. And I told myself, my God, you know, first time I'm reading so much about one person who made such an important, who made a big impact, you know, in Indian poetry, in philosophy, and of course in politics. I just wanted to concentrate on one part of Iqbal, which kind of fascinated me. Not so much about his poetry, which has been done to some length here, but on his political life. And reading, and that's the last the last section of the book is on Iqbal and his politics. And a couple of things that emerge from there. These are the takeaways for me about this man. That he was, even in the 1920s, his thinking, his political thought was very modern. I could sense that in Zafar's book. And there is, and not just in his thought, but even in some of his actions. And there's one quote that kind of stood out in my mind of what he said. And he said, never give up on the East, never turn away from the West. You can see that the man in 1920s not wanting to give up on the West, but at the same time, he says, don't give up on the East. The second part of his political life, which I could gather from the book, he seemed to be a kind of a reluctant politician. He was in the Legislative Assembly. He was persuaded by people to stand for election. He stood, he won, but he stayed on only for 3 years. And when he finished, obviously he was very unhappy because he couldn't do a lot of the things that he wanted to do. And he ends off, he gives his reason for not wanting to continue in electoral politics. And he uses, again, poem. Like the tulip in the wilderness, I stand alone in the assembly. He's so lonely in the assembly that he said nobody else could I presume, do or the things that he wanted to do, he couldn't achieve. So he quits. Finally, I just have, on politics itself, the politician that he was, I got a distinct sense that he was very disappointed with politics, and that my wish, and I'm sure it's Iqbal's wish too, although it's fruitless to talk about the wish because the man is no more here, that if he had just stuck with poetry, I think he would have achieved much more happiness, and his life would not have ended with the kind of disappointment that I think he ended up with. Thank you.
You talked of East and West and the way sort of it unites in Iqbal's mind and in his feelings. We had the chairman quote from his feelings when his mother died, for instance. It's universal when you heard about it. Much like what Oscar Wilde had written in De Profundis when he heard of his mother's death. He had said, never even in the most perfect days of my development as an artist could I have found words fit enough to move so august a burden or to bear with sufficient stateliness of music the purple pageant of my incommunicable woe. Very much like the same kind of feeling that Iqbal reflected in his poem. Politics, you say, okay, I mean, he died, he passed away in 1938, I think, 38, yes. But the contribution he left, and this is what we shall discuss, if one were to a certain extent, bear those in mind today, would we see a more unified ethos among the differences that we have talked about so much over the past 2 days in the subcontinent. I'll open the floor to discussion on these and other topics. And yes, sir, Mr. Jumaboy.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you very much for producing this wonderful book. I just want to share a few experiences of mine. When I was a refugee during the Japanese attack on Singapore, we were sent to India. And I went to a college called Ismail Yusuf College in Bombay. And the reason why I stood up was to mention Zakaria. His father, you're talking of Rafiq? Yes. Rafiq Zakaria was a classmate of mine. He was a couple of years older. So was a cousin of mine, Hussein Parpia. So was Maulana, I forget the name, Maulana, very famous Maulana in India. And at that time, the most famous song that would have become the national song of India was Sare Jahan Se Acha, Hindustan Hamara, Hindi hai Watan hai Hamara, Gulistan Hamara. So that was what we used to stand at attention and sing. And I hope that this would recreate Iqbal's heartfelt feeling of bringing the subcontinental countries today together, particularly the goodwill for Pakistan that exists because of people like Iqbal and others like him. So I just wanted to share this before I leave, that it was there for 4 years. Of course, after the war, I came home to Singapore. But this was my experience. And
when was this? What
1942
time?
to 1946. We had in our school, it was mainly a Muslim school, graduates from Aligarh University. And we always had a tussle because I didn't know politics in India. I was an Indian boy from Singapore over there. And these fellows were saying, you're Hindu, you're Muslim. I said, what the hell are you? Oh, that's your religion. My religion, I know my religion. That's got nothing to do with politics, you see. So it was a great experience even for me. But I learned a lot from the freedom struggle for India's independence. So I just wanted to share this, and thank you very much for publishing this.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for your contribution, Mr. Jumaboy. I've noticed that whenever we discuss in ISAS Hoch Politik, you come up with gems of your recollections, these memoirs, and always through those make a contribution and enrich our discussions. Thank you very much. Floor is open. Yes.
My question is mainly that I think Allama Iqbal at that time saw himself as in, with the main corpus of his work, as in, I suppose he wrote keeping a Muslim audience in mind. And his main subjects were, well, Islamic in nature, philosophical or pragmatic and otherwise. So I was just, as in this is unlike, I suppose, other Urdu poets before and after him, Faiz or Ghalib. But how does that translate, would you say, in today's world? As in, like, if there is to be a rediscovery of Allama Iqbal, of course, the majority of his corpus would have to deal with the Muslim philosophy. Would this therefore be applicable to Muslims, or would you say it's more
Iqbal has recited or written poetry on so many topics, From he has translated the Gayatri Mantra as Aftab, the sun. He wrote a poem on Pandit Ram Tirath, one of the saints in his town in Lahore, when he died in a river. He wrote a poem on that. You just heard he wrote a poem on the death of his mother. He wrote a poem on Lenin. He wrote a poem when he went to Spain. He wrote a poem on so many different figures, historical figures. At this point, I would like to read a little passage which will show you what kind of writer he was. Iqbal has also addressed the question of Sufism. In his time, he was given the fatwa of being a kafir. Like Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, he was also given this fatwa of being a kafir because of his poetry. He criticized Sufism at that point of time because Sufism was sort of creating an inertia in people. And from Europe, he had learned this message of action. So he said, become a man of action, do something. Don't just sit there in a corner and pray to God and think that things will change for you. If you want to change things, go out into the world and change it with yourself, with your own hands. One of his poems, he says that, do you like the world? God asks man, do you like the world? And the man says, no, I don't like it. Then God says, go ahead, smash it, and make it the way you want to make it. So that was his message. So he criticized Sufism at that point of time. But he was also a follower of Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi. And this little passage I'm going to read now, which will show the kind of personalities, kind of thoughts he addressed. The ideal Sufi for Iqbal was Jalaluddin Rumi, who could be aptly regarded as Iqbal's spiritual teacher. In one of his poems, Iqbal undertakes an imaginary journey with Rumi as his guide. They pass through the heavenly abodes of many saints and sages. They ask them questions and receive their wise answers. Remarkably, the first soul the poet and Rumi encounter is a Hindu saint, Vishwamitra. This saint has dedicated thousands of years in devotion, has eyes brilliant with his spiritual knowledge, a black serpent around his neck, and a halo of white hair. Vishwamitra asks Rumi, who is this young man with you? His eyes betray an intense desire for life. Rumi answers, this fellow is the seeker of truth. Though he lacks in maturity, his heart is full of a yearning. He is like an eagle who seeks to go around the 7 heavens. The sage is pleased to see the younger seeker and asks him what condition prevails with the people of the East. An awakening of the spirit is visible among the Orientals, Iqbal replies, as a result of which they do not feel helpless any longer, nor are they sunk in laziness and inactivity. I showed them the brilliance of the treasure bequeathed to them by their ancestors, and this has moved in them a desire for noble achievements. They are no longer inclined to worship the idols of the West. So you could see anti-colonialism. He could see trying to wake up people of his nation, of his country. Then after Vishwamitra, he meets Bhartari Hari, who was a Sanskrit poet, Zarathustra, and Jibreel, and Iblis, and also Nietzsche. So this is a long poem, and he keeps going on his journey and meets and discusses all these people, asking questions, seeking answers, and all that. So this is just one aspect. He's written on communism and a lot of other stuff as well.
If there is anything we have learned in these past 2 days of discussion, it is that South Asia has so many facets. Now, each facet has its own heroes. And each of those heroes is also a hero to the other facets of South Asia. That has been at the broadest level, the takeaway from this conference today. When Faiz Ahmed Faiz, for instance, wrote, "Jab taaj ujhale jayenge, jab takht giraye jayenge," जब राज करेंगे खल्क खुदा जो तुम भी हो और मैं भी हूँ हम देखेंगे was not meant for the socialists and communists of India alone. So he too is accepted as everyone's. So this has been the broad takeaway from here, that India is varied, South Asia is varied, South Asia is vast. There have been, every age in South Asia has responded to the questions of that era in its own fashion. We've talked about the whole region or the whole of South Asia being in a flux, and the difficulty in attending to each and every moment in the course of this flux. So yes, today, if you are to take the poet away from his milieu, you would see him differently. So would we not see Homer in the same way? Would we not see Shakespeare in the same way? Yes, but they don't cease to be global heroes even to this day, even if the milieu is different.
Of course, I'm not very sure of the facts, but what was the kind of equation, I'm using a modern day word, between, say, Gandhi and Iqbal on one side and Gandhi and Jinnah on the other side? Thank you.
Well, I would talk about one letter that Gandhiji wrote when he heard the news of Iqbal's death. And he was in jail probably. He wrote this letter in Urdu, and he said that when I was in jail, I used to go to sleep with reciting Iqbal, Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara, hundreds of times. And every time I read that, I recited that poem, I felt great peace and satisfaction. So this one you could see. I don't remember seeing any particular statements from Gandhiji on Iqbal's politics or anything. As far as Jinnah is concerned, of course, as far as the leadership of Muslims was concerned, Iqbal had chosen Jinnah as the leader, that he should lead, because Iqbal knew that Jinnah was a great organizer. He was a constitutionalist. He was educated in the West. He could organize people. He had vast experience. He had done it in England. He had done it in India. And he was one of the most honest men he had ever seen. So he admired him that way. And whenever the question of leadership came of the Muslims in India, he unequivocally said that it has to be Jinnah. Even when Nehru went to meet him, he told him that as far as the question of Muslim leadership is concerned, it is settled, pointing to Jinnah. So briefly that.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This brings us to the end of our conference, the annual conference. It's been a very, very interesting, stimulating 2 days. We have learnt a lot. We have deliberated a lot. Just because there is a problem, remember, there is not an answer, but there is always deliberations leading to someday to an answer, or to at least the fulfillment of aspirations for that particular point in time, and which is what I was referring to a little while ago. I should like to thank all of you for attending this conference, making it a success, the leadership of the conference, the leadership of ISAS, the chairman, the director, all the researchers, professors, audience, seen and unseen hands behind and in the front, etc. Thank you all, and till we meet again.